What if I told you that a single act of cowardice in the desert doomed an entire civilization to prophetic extinction? Hidden in the genealogies of Genesis lies a name that would become God's sworn enemy for all generations: Amalek. But here's what haunts scholars. Why did the Almighty, who forgave Egypt's slavery and Nineveh's wickedness, declare absolute war against these desert dwellers? What unspeakable act did they commit that triggered the most chilling decree in Scripture? I will completely erase their memory from under heaven. The Amalekites weren't just another enemy. They were blood relatives of Israel, descendants of Abraham's own grandson, yet something twisted in their souls. Picture this: exhausted slaves, finally free after 400 years of bondage, staggering through the wilderness. Who attacks them? Not their mighty pursuers, but desert raiders who specifically hunted the weakest, slaughtering children and elderly stragglers from behind. Why? The answer reveals something so disturbing about human nature that God himself said, "Enough." A king would lose everything for sparing their ruler. A prophet would become an executioner. Even today, their name carries a mystery. How does an entire people vanish so completely that archaeologists struggle to find their trace? Prepare to discover why the Amalekites became the one enemy God promised to personally destroy. Every nation has a beginning, and the story of the Amalekites starts with a family tree that connects directly back to Abraham himself. To understand who these people were, we need to travel back to the book of Genesis and look at a family line that would produce one of Israel's greatest enemies. Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, had several sons. His firstborn was named Eliphaz. Now Eliphaz had a concubine, a secondary wife, whose name was Timnah. Genesis chapter 36 verse 12 tells us plainly, Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. This is where it all began. A child was born, and his name was Amalek. Think about what this means. Amalek was Esau's grandson, which made him the great-grandson of Isaac and the great-great-grandson of Abraham. The Amalekites weren't strangers or foreigners from a distant land. They carried the blood of the patriarchs in their veins. They were family, distant cousins to the Israelites, who would later descend from Jacob. The same chapter in Genesis goes on to list Amalek among the chiefs of Edom. Verse 16 mentions him specifically: Korah, Gatam, and Amalek. These were the chiefs descended from Eliphaz in Edom. They were grandsons of Ada. He wasn't just another descendant. He became a chief, a leader, someone whose name carried weight and authority among Esau's descendants. This genealogical connection is crucial because it shows us that the Amalekites didn't come from nowhere. They had roots, heritage, and a place in the family line that went back to Abraham's covenant with God. Yet somehow, this branch of the family tree would grow in a completely different direction than their relatives. While other descendants of Esau settled in the mountainous regions of Seir, the Amalekites chose a different path. They moved south into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness areas. The Negev Desert and the Sinai Peninsula became their home, lands where water was scarce, vegetation was sparse, and survival required special knowledge and skills. The Negev sits at the southern edge of what would become Israel's territory. It's a transition zone between the settled lands to the north and the vast wilderness to the south. The Sinai Peninsula stretches even further south, a massive expanse of desert, mountains, and rocky terrain. These weren't places where you could easily grow crops or build cities. These were lands for people who knew how to survive in extreme conditions. The Amalekites adapted to this harsh environment. They learned where every spring and well could be found. They knew which wadis, dry riverbeds, would temporarily fill with water during the rare rains. They understood how to navigate through mountain passes and across open desert. This knowledge became their greatest asset. By choosing these territories, the Amalekites positioned themselves along the southern approach to Canaan. Any group traveling from Egypt toward the Promised Land would have to pass through or near Amalekite territory. The major trade routes between Egypt and the lands to the northeast ran through these regions. This wasn't random chance. The Amalekites occupied strategic ground. They didn't build great cities or establish permanent settlements like other peoples. Instead, they remained mobile, moving their camps according to the seasons and the availability of resources. Their tents could be packed up and relocated quickly. This mobility gave them advantages that settled peoples didn't have. They could strike and then disappear into the wilderness where others couldn't follow. The landscape itself became their ally. Strangers didn't know the terrain. They didn't know where to find water or which paths through the mountains were passable. But the Amalekites knew every rock and every hidden valley. This intimate knowledge of the land made them dangerous to anyone passing through their territory. Here's something that puzzles many Bible readers. The Amalekites appear in Scripture before Amalek was even born. This seems impossible at first, but it tells us something important about how ancient peoples thought about land and identity. In Genesis chapter 14, we find Abraham involved in a rescue mission. Several kings had gone to war, and Abraham's nephew Lot had been captured. Abraham gathered his trained men and pursued the kings who had taken Lot. Verse 7 describes the route of these kings. Then they turned back and went to En-Mishpat, that is, Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazezon Tamar. Wait, the territory of the Amalekites? But this happened during Abraham's lifetime, long before his great-great-grandson Amalek was born. How can this be? The answer is that Moses, who wrote Genesis, was describing the geography in terms his readers would understand. He was saying, they conquered the area that you now know as Amalekite territory. It's like saying Columbus sailed to the Americas, even though that name didn't exist in his time. This reference shows us that by the time Moses was writing, the Amalekites were so well established in that region that the land itself was identified with them. Their presence had become permanent and recognizable. Everyone knew Amalekite territory. It was a fixed part of the geographical landscape. The fact that Moses used this reference tells us the Amalekites had been in those southern desert regions for a very long time. Generations had passed. They had made those lands their own so completely that the territory bore their name. This wasn't a new people just finding their place. By the time Israel encountered them, they were an ancient, established presence in the Negev and Sinai. Living in the desert shaped everything about Amalekite society. They couldn't farm the land. There wasn't enough water or fertile soil. They couldn't build trading cities. They were nomads, constantly moving. So they developed a culture centered on something else, taking what others had produced. The Amalekites became raiders. This wasn't occasional or opportunistic. Raiding became their way of life, their economy, their identity. They watched the trade routes that crossed their territory. Caravans carrying valuable goods from Egypt to Mesopotamia or from Arabia to Canaan had to pass through the lands the Amalekites controlled. These caravans were vulnerable. They traveled slowly, loaded with merchandise. Their guards were often few in number, hired to protect against common bandits, but not prepared for organized military strikes. The Amalekites would watch and wait. They knew the routes. They knew where caravans would camp for the night. They knew where the terrain gave them the advantage. When they struck fast. Desert warfare requires speed and surprise. The Amalekites would attack suddenly, overwhelming their targets before any organized defense could form. They would seize whatever was valuable, spices, textiles, metals, livestock, and then vanish back into the desert. By the time any help could arrive, the raiders were gone, scattered across terrain that strangers couldn't navigate. This lifestyle required certain skills and values. Amalekite men were trained as warriors from youth. They learned to ride, to fight, to endure the hardships of desert travel. They learned to live on little water and sparse food when necessary. They became hard, tough, and ruthless. Mercy was weakness. Hesitation meant death. But raiding wasn't just about survival. It became a source of pride, a measure of a man's worth. Successful raids brought wealth and status. The boldest raiders became leaders. Stories of daring attacks were told around campfires. Young men grew up hearing tales of their fathers' and grandfathers' exploits, dreaming of their own chance to prove themselves in battle. This culture also meant the Amalekites were always at war with someone. Peaceful neighbors don't appreciate being raided. Merchants whose caravans were attacked wanted revenge. Settled peoples whose villages were plundered sought protection or retaliation. The Amalekites lived in a constant state of conflict, which only reinforced their warrior culture and their reliance on violence. The Amalekites came from Esau's line, making them part of the broader Edomite family. But family relationships in the ancient world were complicated, and blood ties didn't always mean unity or friendship. Other descendants of Esau settled in different areas and lived different lifestyles. Many Edomite clans established themselves in the mountainous region of Seir, east of the Araba Valley. These mountains offered better protection and more resources than the open desert. Over time, these Edomites built towns, developed agriculture in the valleys, and established a more settled way of life. The Amalekites chose differently. They remained in the southern deserts, keeping their nomadic lifestyle. This geographical and cultural separation created distance between them and their Edomite cousins. They were related by blood, but they didn't live the same way or share the same interests. Sometimes this relationship worked to mutual benefit. When it served their purposes, the Amalekites might cooperate with other Edomite groups. If a common enemy threatened both peoples, they might join forces. Marriages between families created connections and alliances. Trade in goods and information flowed between the groups, but the relationship was never one of full integration or unity. The Amalekites maintained their distinct identity. They didn't consider themselves just another Edomite clan. They were the Amalekites, separate, independent, answering to their own chiefs and following their own ways. Their desert culture and raiding economy set them apart from the more settled Edomite communities. This independence meant they often acted alone. When the Amalekites decided to raid a caravan or attack a settlement, they didn't need permission or agreement from other Edomite leaders. They made their own decisions and took their own risks. If those decisions brought consequences, those consequences fell on them alone. The Edomites who lived in Seir developed a more organized society over time, eventually forming a kingdom with a succession of kings. The Amalekites never followed this path. They remained tribal, led by chiefs whose authority came from strength and success, rather than dynastic succession. This different political structure further distinguished them from their Edomite relatives. North of Amalekite territory lay the land of Canaan, inhabited by various peoples who had established city-states and agricultural communities. The Amalekites' proximity to these Canaanite groups meant interaction was inevitable, though the nature of these interactions varied. The Canaanite city-states represented a completely different civilization from the nomadic Amalekites. They had walls, temples, organized governments, and agricultural economies. They traded with distant lands and developed sophisticated cultures. From their fortified cities, Canaanite kings controlled surrounding territories and collected tribute from villages. For the Amalekites, the Canaanites represented both opportunity and limitation. The Canaanite cities were wealthy, but they were also well defended. Attacking a fortified city required siege equipment and sustained effort, things nomadic raiders couldn't manage. So direct assault on Canaanite cities was rarely practical. Instead, the Amalekites focused on softer targets. Farming villages outside city walls were vulnerable. Harvest time, when grain was gathered and stored, offered opportunities for raids. Travelers and small caravans moving between cities could be attacked. The Amalekites learned to take what they could without provoking the full military response of a Canaanite king. Sometimes political circumstances created opportunities for cooperation. A Canaanite king might hire Amalekite raiders as mercenaries when he was at war with a rival city-state. The Amalekites would get payment and plunder, while the Canaanite king got additional military force without maintaining a standing army. These arrangements were temporary and based purely on mutual benefit, not trust or friendship. At other times, Canaanite kings would organize punitive expeditions against the Amalekites if their raids became too damaging. A king couldn't allow his territories to be plundered without response, or he would appear weak. So occasionally, Canaanite armies would march into the desert, trying to punish the raiders and discourage future attacks. These expeditions rarely succeeded in catching the mobile Amalekites, but they sent a message. Despite these interactions, the Amalekites never integrated into Canaanite civilization. They didn't adopt Canaanite culture, religion, or lifestyle. They remained separate, keeping their desert ways and their raiding economy. The Canaanites represented settled civilization, everything the Amalekites had chosen not to become. Most ancient peoples built their economies on agriculture or trade. They planted crops, raised livestock, crafted goods, or facilitated the exchange of merchandise between distant lands. The Amalekites chose a different path entirely. Their economy was parasitic, depending on taking what others had produced. Raiding wasn't a supplement to their economy. It was their economy. The wealth of the Amalekites came from the labor of others. When merchants worked for months to gather valuable goods and transport them across desert routes, the Amalekites waited to seize those goods in a single, violent encounter. When farmers spent seasons cultivating crops, the Amalekites arrived at harvest time to take the produce. This economic model had certain advantages. The Amalekites didn't need to invest time in planting and tending crops. They didn't need to maintain trade relationships or build workshops. They didn't need permanent settlements with all the infrastructure that requires. Their needs were simpler, and they could focus their energy on warfare and mobility. Livestock formed an important part of their wealth. When they raided, they took sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. These animals provided food, transportation, and trading goods. Large herds indicated wealth and success. A successful raider could become rich in livestock, using his wealth to support multiple wives and many children, increasing his status and influence. But this economic foundation created inherent instability. The Amalekites produced nothing themselves. Their wealth fluctuated based on the success of raids. A string of successful attacks could make them prosperous. But if potential targets improved their defenses, or if stronger forces drove the Amalekites away from good raiding areas, their wealth could quickly disappear. This parasitic economy also meant the Amalekites needed others to remain productive. If they destroyed all the settlements in their region, killed all the traders, and drove away all the caravans, they would have nothing left to raid. So there was a perverse balance to maintain: raid enough to prosper, but not so much that the sources of wealth disappeared entirely. The dependence on plunder shaped Amalekite values and perspectives. Why work when you can take? Why build when you can seize? Why create when you can steal? These attitudes, reinforced over generations, became deeply embedded in their culture. Work was for others. Taking was the Amalekite way. Long before Israel encountered the Amalekites at Rephidim, these desert raiders had already established a fearsome reputation across the region. Their name was known, their methods were understood, their cruelty was recognized. This reputation served both as a weapon and as a shield. Fear is a powerful tool in warfare and survival. When travelers heard they would be crossing Amalekite territory, they prepared for the worst. They hired extra guards. They traveled in larger groups. They watched constantly for any sign of raiders. This fear could sometimes prevent attacks. The Amalekites might decide a well-prepared caravan wasn't worth the risk. But fear also isolated the Amalekites. Other peoples didn't seek friendship with them. They weren't invited to join alliances or trading partnerships. They were avoided when possible and opposed when necessary. The Amalekites were known as enemies, as threats, as people to be wary of. This isolation, however, didn't bother them. They had chosen their path. Stories about Amalekite raids circulated throughout the region. Survivors told of sudden attacks without warning. Merchants who lost entire caravans described the speed and violence of Amalekite warfare. These stories reinforced the reputation and spread the fear further. Each generation heard tales of Amalekite raids, learning to be cautious when traveling through the southern regions. What made the Amalekites particularly feared was their willingness to attack the vulnerable. Many ancient warrior cultures had codes about fighting. You fought warriors, not women and children. You gave enemies a chance to surrender. You showed mercy to the defeated. The Amalekites didn't follow these codes. They saw vulnerability as opportunity, not as a reason for restraint. This reputation for ruthlessness meant that when people saw Amalekite raiders approaching, they knew to expect no mercy. Surrender wouldn't save them. Pleading wouldn't help. The Amalekites would take what they wanted and leave only what they didn't value. This knowledge created terror, and terror was exactly what the Amalekites wanted. Terrified people don't fight back effectively. They panic, scatter, and make mistakes. By the time Egypt's enslaved Hebrews crossed the Red Sea and entered the wilderness, the Amalekites had been raiding the southern desert regions for generations. Their reputation was well established. Their territory was clearly defined. Their methods were understood. They were a known quantity in the region, dangerous, cruel, and always watching for opportunities to attack the weak. The Israelites had just witnessed something impossible. They had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, while water stood like walls on both sides. They had seen Pharaoh's army drowned behind them. They were free after 400 years of slavery in Egypt. But freedom in the wilderness came with new challenges. They traveled through the desert and the journey was hard. These weren't trained soldiers or experienced travelers. They were families, men, women, children, and elderly people who had spent their lives making bricks in Egypt. Now they walked through harsh terrain with limited supplies, learning to trust God for each day's provision. The Israelites came to a place called Rephidim. They camped there, but there was a problem. There was no water. The people were thirsty, and their complaints grew loud. They quarreled with Moses, demanding water. Moses cried out to God, and the Lord told him to strike a rock at Horeb. Moses obeyed, and water poured out for the people to drink. This was the situation at Rephidim. A massive group of former slaves, exhausted from travel, dealing with thirst and complaints, just beginning to learn what it meant to follow God through the wilderness. They were vulnerable. They were disorganized. They were not a threat to anyone. Then Exodus chapter 17 verse 8 records what happened next. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. No warning, no provocation, no territorial dispute or previous conflict. The Amalekites simply came and attacked. Israel hadn't entered Amalekite territory demanding anything. They hadn't threatened the Amalekites or raided their camps. They were refugees passing through the wilderness, trying to survive. But the Amalekites saw opportunity where others might have seen fellow human beings in need. They saw thousands of people with possessions, livestock, and no military organization. They saw easy targets. This attack wasn't about defense or protection. It was about predation. The Amalekites looked at a vulnerable population and decided to strike. This moment would define the relationship between these two peoples for centuries to come. The Amalekite attack at Rephidim wasn't just unprovoked. It was calculated and cruel in its execution. They didn't challenge Israel's strongest warriors to an honorable battle. They employed a tactic that revealed something dark about their character. Years later, Moses would remind the people about this attack. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 and 18, he told them, "Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God." Think about what this means. When a large group travels through difficult terrain, some people naturally fall behind. The elderly can't walk as fast. Sick people struggle to keep pace. Small children tire easily and slow down. Pregnant women need to rest more often. These vulnerable people end up at the rear of the traveling group. The Amalekites specifically targeted these stragglers. They didn't attack the front of the column where the strongest men traveled. They struck from behind, cutting down those who couldn't defend themselves. Elderly men and women who had survived decades of slavery in Egypt were killed as they struggled to keep up with their families. Children were cut down as they walked. Sick and weak people who were already suffering were shown no mercy. This wasn't warfare. This was slaughter. Warriors fight other warriors, but the Amalekites chose to kill the defenseless. They picked the easiest victims, the ones who couldn't fight back, the ones who posed no threat. This tactical decision showed a complete absence of human compassion. Moses added a crucial detail. They had no fear of God. The Amalekites knew what had happened in Egypt. News traveled in the ancient world. Stories of the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, and the destruction of Pharaoh's army would have spread throughout the region. Everyone knew that Israel's God was powerful and protective of his people. But the Amalekites didn't care. They showed no reverence, no caution, no respect for the God who had just performed miracles. They saw vulnerable people and attacked, regardless of divine protection or moral boundaries. This fearlessness wasn't courage. It was a rejection of any authority beyond their own desires. The Amalekite attack forced Israel to respond. They couldn't just run. Where would they go? They had to stand and fight. Moses called for a man named Joshua and gave him specific instructions. Exodus chapter 17, verse 9 records Moses' command. "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." This was Joshua's first appearance as a military leader. He wasn't an experienced general. Like everyone else, he had been a slave in Egypt. But Moses trusted him with this critical task. Joshua did exactly what Moses asked. He selected men from among the Israelites to form a fighting force. Meanwhile, Moses climbed to the top of a nearby hill, taking Aaron and a man named Hur with him. Moses held up the staff of God, the same staff that had been raised over the Red Sea, the same staff that had brought plagues on Egypt. Verses 11 and 12 describe what happened during the battle. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. This was a strange way to fight a battle. Joshua and his men did the actual fighting on the ground, striking with swords and defending against Amalekite attacks. But the outcome of the battle depended on Moses keeping his hands raised on the hilltop. When his arms were up, Israel prevailed. When his arms dropped from exhaustion, Amalek gained advantage. Aaron and Hur recognized what was happening. They found a stone for Moses to sit on, taking some of the physical burden off him. Then they stood on either side, physically holding his arms up when he could no longer do it himself. They maintained this position until sunset. Verse 13 gives the result. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. The battle was won. Israel's first military engagement ended in victory. But everyone understood this victory came from God, not from their own military skill. The raised staff symbolized dependence on divine power, and that dependence made the difference. After the battle ended and Israel had defeated the Amalekite attack, God spoke to Moses. What he said was unlike anything he had said about any other nation. This wasn't just a statement about one battle. It was a declaration that would echo through generations. Exodus chapter 17 verse 14 records God's words. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." God commanded that this promise be written down permanently. It had to be remembered. And specifically, Joshua, who had just led Israel's forces in battle, needed to hear and understand this divine decree. The phrase, "blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven," was absolute. God wasn't talking about defeating them in battle or driving them away. He was talking about complete erasure, total destruction, the end of their existence as a people. Their very name would be removed from the earth. Why such a severe pronouncement? Other nations had opposed Israel. Egypt had enslaved them for 400 years. Yet God didn't decree Egypt's total destruction. He judged Egypt with plagues and destroyed Pharaoh's army, but the nation continued to exist. The Amalekites, however, received a different sentence. The answer lies in what they had done. They attacked without cause. They targeted the vulnerable intentionally. They showed no fear of God, despite his obvious power and protection over Israel. This wasn't just an act of war, it was an act that revealed something fundamentally corrupt about Amalekite character and culture. Moses' response to God's declaration was immediate. Verse 15 says, "Moses built an altar and called it, 'The Lord is my banner.'" The name reflected what had just happened. God had been Israel's banner, their rallying point, their source of victory. The raised staff on the hilltop had been like a battle standard that the troops could look to. Then Moses made another statement recorded in verse 16. He said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." This wasn't a war that would end with one battle or one generation. This was perpetual war, continuing through time until the divine decree was fulfilled. The phrase, "hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord," explains why this war was different. When the Amalekites attacked Israel, they weren't just attacking a group of people. They were attacking the people God had chosen, the people he was protecting, the people through whom he was revealing himself to the world. To attack Israel was to attack God's purposes and plans. The Amalekites had positioned themselves as enemies, not just of Israel, but of God himself. Time passed, and Israel moved through the wilderness. Eventually, they camped at Kadesh Barnea, on the border of the Promised Land. Moses sent 12 spies to explore Canaan and bring back a report. The spies returned after 40 days with amazing news about the land's fertility, but 10 of them also brought fearful reports about the strength of the people living there. The Israelites' response was rebellion. They refused to enter the land, despite God's promise to give it to them. They even talked about choosing a new leader and returning to Egypt. God's anger burned against them, and he declared that this generation would not enter the Promised Land. They would wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all the adults who had rebelled died off. When the people heard this judgment, they suddenly changed their minds. Now they wanted to go into the land. Moses warned them not to, explaining that God was no longer with them in this effort. But they didn't listen. Numbers chapter 14, verse 44 describes what happened. Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp. They went without Moses' leadership and without the ark, the symbol of God's presence. They were acting on their own now. Verse 45 gives the result. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. The Amalekites were there, controlling parts of the southern hill country. When Israel tried to invade without God's blessing, the Amalekites joined with the Canaanites to defend the territory. This battle was completely different from Rephidim. At Rephidim, Israel had God's support and won despite being inexperienced. Here they presumed to fight without God's presence, and they were utterly defeated. The Amalekites helped chase them all the way back to Hormah, inflicting heavy losses. This defeat taught Israel a hard lesson. They couldn't win battles on their own strength or their own timing. Victory required obedience and divine support. The Amalekites, meanwhile, had successfully defended territory and driven back an invasion attempt. Decades later, as Israel prepared to finally enter the Promised Land, a strange event occurred. The king of Moab, terrified by Israel's presence near his territory, hired a prophet named Balaam to curse Israel. But every time Balaam opened his mouth to curse, God put blessings in his mouth instead. Balaam spoke several oracles about Israel and the nations around them. One of these oracles specifically mentioned the Amalekites. Numbers chapter 24, verse 20, records the moment. Then Balaam saw Amalek and spoke his message. Amalek was first among the nations, but their end will be utter destruction. The phrase, first among the nations, has been interpreted different ways. It might refer to Amalek being an ancient, well-established people, or it might mean they were the first nation to attack Israel after the Exodus, the first to raise their hand against God's chosen people. Either way, Balaam acknowledged that the Amalekites had a significant position and history, but that history would end. Their end will be utter destruction. This wasn't Balaam's opinion or wish. It was a prophetic declaration from God. The same God who had promised at Rephidim to blot out Amalek's name was now confirming through a foreign prophet that this judgment would certainly happen. Balaam's oracle added another layer to the divine decree against Amalek. It wasn't just Moses who had heard God's promise of their destruction. Now, through Balaam, the surrounding nations heard it too. The Moabites, the Midianites, and anyone else present when Balaam spoke these oracles knew that the Amalekites were marked for complete destruction by Israel's God. After Joshua's death, Israel entered a difficult period. The book of Judges describes cycles where Israel would fall into sin. God would allow enemies to oppress them, the people would cry out for help, and God would raise up a judge to deliver them. The Amalekites appear several times during this period, always as oppressors or raiders. The first mention comes during the story of Eglon, king of Moab. Judges chapter 3 verse 13 says, "Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms." The Amalekites formed part of a coalition with Moab and Ammon to attack and oppress Israel. They helped capture Jericho, the city of palms, and Israel served Eglon for 18 years before God raised up Ehud to deliver them. Later, the Amalekites joined an even more devastating campaign. When the Midianites oppressed Israel during Gideon's time, the Amalekites were right there with them. Judges chapter 6, verses 3 through 5 describe the situation. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. This was systematic destruction. Every year when Israel planted crops and worked their fields, these raiders would arrive in massive numbers. They weren't just stealing food, they were destroying Israel's ability to survive. They left nothing, no crops, no livestock, nothing. The comparison to locusts was appropriate. They came in overwhelming numbers and consumed everything. Verse 6 gives the result. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. The Amalekites were part of a campaign that brought Israel to desperation. This wasn't occasional raiding. This was annual devastation that lasted 7 years. The Amalekites had returned to their old patterns, joining with others to prey on Israel's vulnerability. God raised up Gideon to deliver Israel from the Midianite Amalekite oppression. Through a series of miraculous signs, God reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 men to just 300, so that Israel would know the victory came from God, not from military might. With these 300 men, Gideon attacked the vast Midianite camp at night, causing panic and confusion. The enemy forces fled, and Gideon's men pursued them. Judges chapter 7 verse 24 says, Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. Other Israelite tribes joined the pursuit, cutting off escape routes. But the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, escaped with 15,000 men, all that remained of their massive army. Gideon didn't stop pursuing. Judges chapter 8 verse 10 describes where he found them. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. The pursuit took Gideon through territory controlled by the Amalekites and their allies. His 300 men were exhausted, having fought all night and then chased the enemy for many miles. Verses 4 and 5 say, Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Sukkoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." The towns in this region, Sukkoth and Peniel, refused to help Gideon. They were afraid that if Gideon failed to capture the Midianite kings, those kings would return and punish anyone who had helped him. They wouldn't risk supporting Gideon's pursuit. Despite exhaustion and lack of support, Gideon continued. Verse 11 describes his approach. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the unsuspecting army. He used the routes that nomadic peoples, including the Amalekites, used through that region. He knew the terrain well enough to approach undetected. Verse 12 gives the outcome. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon completed his mission. The oppression that had lasted 7 years was finally ended. The coalition of Midianites, Amalekites, and eastern peoples was broken. Their kings were captured and executed. This victory demonstrated that even though the Amalekites could form powerful alliances and devastate Israel when God allowed it, they couldn't stand when God decided to deliver his people. Gideon's small force, empowered by God, defeated armies that included the Amalekites despite their experience and numbers. Years had passed since the time of the judges, and Israel now had a king. Saul had been anointed by the prophet Samuel and had led Israel in several military victories. But now Samuel came to Saul with a specific message directly from God. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 1 sets the scene. Samuel said to Saul, "I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord." Samuel was reminding Saul of his authority. He was the prophet who had anointed Saul, and he was bringing God's word. Saul needed to pay careful attention. Then Samuel delivered the message. Verses 2 and 3 record God's command. "This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." The reason for this command reached back centuries to Rephidim. God hadn't forgotten what the Amalekites had done when they attacked Israel's weakest members as the people fled slavery. The divine decree spoken at that time that God would blot out Amalek's name was now being carried out. The instructions were extremely specific. Saul was to destroy everything. The Hebrew word used here is herem, which means devoted to destruction, completely destroyed. Nothing was to be spared or kept. Every person, every animal, everything the Amalekites possessed was to be destroyed. This command is difficult for modern readers to understand. Why such complete destruction? The text points back to the original sin, the unprovoked attack on vulnerable refugees, the targeting of the weak and defenseless, the complete lack of fear of God. The Amalekites had become a symbol of opposition to God's purposes, and their culture of cruelty had been passed down through generations. Saul received these instructions clearly. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The prophet who had anointed him king was standing before him, delivering God's direct command. Saul's response would reveal much about his character and his fitness to be king. Saul responded to God's command by gathering his forces. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 4 says, "So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah." This was a massive army, showing that Saul took the mission seriously and mobilized significant military resources. Verse 5 describes Saul's approach. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. He used military strategy, positioning his forces for maximum advantage. The Amalekites had cities by this time, not just nomadic camps, indicating they had established more permanent settlements over the centuries. Before attacking, Saul sent a warning to another group living in the area. Verse 6 records, "Then he said to the Kenites, 'Go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt.'" So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. The Kenites were related to Moses' father-in-law and had helped Israel during the Exodus. Saul made sure they wouldn't be caught in the destruction, showing he could distinguish between Israel's enemies and those who had shown kindness. Then the attack began. Verse 7 gives the scope. "Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt." This was a comprehensive campaign covering the entire range of Amalekite territory. From Havilah in the Arabian desert to Shur near Egypt, Saul's forces swept through all the lands the Amalekites controlled. Verse 8 describes the military outcome. "He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword." From a military standpoint, this was a complete victory. Saul's forces defeated the Amalekite army, destroyed their population, and captured their king. The Amalekites, as a military power, were broken. Their cities were conquered. Their people were killed in battle. The campaign showed Saul's capabilities as a military commander. He could organize large forces, plan strategic attacks, and execute comprehensive operations across wide territories. He had achieved what God sent him to do. Or had he? Saul had won the battle completely. The Amalekites were defeated. Their king was captured. But then Saul made decisions that would change everything. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 9 reveals what happened. "But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed." Read that carefully. Saul kept King Agag alive. The army kept the best livestock, the valuable animals that could be sold or used. They destroyed only what was worthless or weak. This was the exact opposite of what God had commanded. God said to destroy everything. Saul decided to keep the valuable things. Why did Saul do this? The text doesn't give us his initial reasoning, but we can see the pattern. The best sheep and cattle were valuable. Why waste them? King Agag was a trophy, a captured enemy king to parade as proof of victory. Saul was making practical decisions, keeping what seemed useful or valuable. But these practical decisions violated direct divine instructions. God hadn't said, "Destroy everything except the valuable things." He said, "Do not spare them." There was no exception clause, no permission to use human judgment to modify the command. Verse 12 shows what Saul did after the battle. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, "Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal." Saul went to Carmel and erected a monument to himself. He was celebrating his victory, commemorating his achievement, building something to honor his own name. This monument reveals Saul's mindset. He saw this campaign as his accomplishment, his victory, his success. He was proud of what he had done. He wanted people to remember his military achievement, but he had forgotten something crucial. This wasn't his mission to accomplish as he saw fit. This was God's judgment being executed through him. The contrast is stark. God said to blot out Amalek's name. Saul built a monument to his own name. God said to destroy everything. Saul kept the best of everything. God gave clear commands. Saul modified them according to his own judgment. While Saul was celebrating his victory and building monuments, God was speaking to Samuel. What God said that night would mark a turning point in Israel's history. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 10 records, "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel." This happened at night, after the battle was over and while Saul was at Carmel. God didn't wait for Samuel to discover Saul's disobedience. He revealed it directly to his prophet. Verse 11 contains God's devastating words, "I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." The word regret here expresses deep grief and sorrow, not that God made a mistake. God was grieved that Saul had failed, that the man chosen to be king had turned away from obedience. Samuel's response shows how deeply this affected him. The verse continues, "Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night." Samuel spent the entire night in prayer, crying out to God. He was angry, whether at Saul, at the situation, or at the implications. We aren't told. But he was deeply troubled and pleaded with God through the night. Why was Saul's disobedience so serious? He had won the battle. He had defeated the Amalekites militarily. He had destroyed most of what God commanded. Wasn't that enough? But God's perspective was different. Partial obedience is disobedience. When God gives specific instructions, following most of them while ignoring parts doesn't count as obedience. The specific issue was what God had commanded regarding Amalek. This wasn't just another battle or another enemy. This was the execution of a divine judgment pronounced centuries earlier at Rephidim. God himself had declared war against Amalek. He had promised to blot out their name. Saul's role was to be the instrument of that divine judgment, not to modify it according to his own wisdom. By sparing Agag and keeping the best livestock, Saul showed he trusted his own judgment more than God's command. He decided what should be destroyed and what should be kept. He substituted his wisdom for God's clear instructions. This revealed a fundamental problem with Saul's character. He would obey God when it made sense to him, but he would adjust or ignore commands that didn't fit his understanding. God's regret over making Saul king meant the relationship was broken. Saul had proven himself unfit for the role. A king of Israel needed to obey God completely, not selectively. The kingdom needed a leader who would trust God's commands even when they didn't make practical sense. The morning after his night of prayer, Samuel traveled to find Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 12 says he was told that Saul had gone to Carmel and then to Gilgal. Samuel went to Gilgal to confront the king. Verse 13 describes their meeting. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you." I have carried out the Lord's instructions." Saul greeted Samuel confidently, even asking for God's blessing on the prophet. Then he claimed complete obedience. "I have carried out the Lord's instructions." In Saul's mind, he had accomplished the mission successfully. Samuel's response was immediate and pointed. Verse 14 records, "But Samuel said, 'What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?'" Samuel could hear the animals Saul had kept. The evidence of disobedience was literally making noise all around them. Saul claimed complete obedience while surrounded by proof of his partial obedience. Saul tried to explain. Verse 15 gives his answer. Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." Notice Saul's defense. First, he blamed the soldiers. They spared the animals, not I spared them. He shifted responsibility away from himself. Second, he claimed a religious purpose. The animals would be sacrificed to God. He was framing disobedience as piety. Samuel wasn't impressed. Verses 16 through 19 record his response. "Enough," Samuel said to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." "Tell me," Saul replied. Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out.' Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" Samuel cut through Saul's excuses. God had given clear instructions. Saul had chosen to take plunder instead. The religious justification didn't matter. The command was to destroy everything, not to keep the best for sacrifice. Saul tried again to defend himself. Verse 20 records, "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king." Saul insisted he had obeyed, even while admitting he brought back the king alive, the very thing God commanded him not to do. Then Samuel delivered one of the most famous statements in Scripture. Verses 22 and 23 record, "But Samuel replied, 'Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king.'" Samuel's words struck at the heart of the issue. Religious rituals don't substitute for obedience. You can't disobey God and then offer him sacrifices from the spoils of your disobedience. Obedience is what God wants. Saul's partial obedience was actually rebellion, rejecting God's word. And that rebellion was as serious as witchcraft or idolatry. The final sentence was devastating. "He has rejected you as king." The kingdom was being taken from Saul. His dynasty would not continue, all because he modified God's clear command regarding the Amalekites. After Samuel's pronouncement that Saul was rejected as king, Saul finally admitted his sin. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 24 and 25 record, "Then Saul said to Samuel, 'I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord.'" Saul confessed, blamed his fear of the people, and asked for forgiveness. But Samuel's response showed the damage was irreversible. Verse 26 says, "But Samuel said to him, 'I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel.'" Samuel refused to return with Saul to worship. The rejection stood. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul grabbed his robe, and it tore. Samuel used even this accident to make a point. Verses 27 and 28 record, "As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, 'The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you.'" After more discussion, Samuel finally agreed to accompany Saul for worship, but then he dealt with the unfinished business. Verse 32 says, "Then Samuel said, 'Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites.' Agag came to him in chains." Some translations say Agag came confidently or cheerfully, suggesting he thought the danger had passed. He had been spared when everyone else was killed. Maybe he believed he would be allowed to live. Verse 32 continues with Agag's words, "And Agag said, 'Surely the bitterness of death is past.'" Agag thought he was safe. He had survived the battle. He had been kept alive for days. Surely if they were going to kill him, they would have done it already. But Samuel had different plans. Verse 33 records Samuel's response and action. "But Samuel said, 'As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women.' And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal." Samuel himself executed the Amalekite king, reminding him of his own cruelty before carrying out the judgment Saul had failed to complete. Samuel's words revealed something about Agag's character and actions. "Your sword has made women childless." Agag had been a brutal king, killing men and leaving widows and orphans. His reign had been marked by violence and cruelty. Now he would face the same fate he had inflicted on others. The execution happened before the Lord at Gilgal, in a place of worship, as an act of completing divine judgment. Samuel personally ensured that God's command was fully carried out, even though the king had failed to do it. Years passed, and David became the next king, the neighbor Samuel had mentioned who was better than Saul. But before David took the throne, he had his own encounters with the Amalekites during his years as a fugitive from Saul. David spent time living among the Philistines for safety. The Philistine king Achish gave him the town of Ziklag as a base. 1 Samuel chapter 27 verses 8 and 9 describe David's activities. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he would return to Achish. David was raiding Amalekite territory, continuing the war God had declared against them. He took their livestock and goods, and he made sure no one survived to report his activities. When Achish asked where he had raided, David would give misleading answers, maintaining his deception while actually fighting Israel's enemies. But then disaster struck. 1 Samuel chapter 30 verses 1 and 2 describe what happened. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. While David was away, Amalekite raiders had struck Ziklag. They burned the town and took everyone captive, including David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. Verse 4 says, "So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep." The devastation was total. Everything was gone. Everyone they loved was captured. David's own men turned against him in their grief. Verse 6 records, "David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God." In his darkest moment, David turned to God for strength. David inquired of the Lord through the priest Abiathar, asking if he should pursue the raiders. Verses 7 and 8 record, "Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, 'Bring me the ephod.' Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?' 'Pursue them,' he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David took 600 men and began pursuit. They found an Egyptian slave who had been left behind by the Amalekites when he became sick. This man agreed to lead David to the raiding party. Verses 16 and 17 describe what David found. He led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David attacked and fought for an entire day and night. Verse 18 gives the outcome. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. He rescued everyone and everything. Verse 19 adds, "Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. The Amalekites had taken captives instead of killing them, perhaps planning to sell them as slaves. This decision allowed David to rescue everyone alive. But the Amalekite raiders themselves were destroyed, except for 400 who escaped on camels." One last significant mention of an Amalekite appears in the Bible's narrative, and it connects directly to Saul's end. After Saul died in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, a young man came to David with news. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verses 1 and 2 set the scene. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. This messenger came with dramatic signs of mourning. Verses 3 and 4 describe the conversation. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he said. "Many of them fell and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." David asked how he knew Saul and Jonathan were dead. The young man's answer appears in verses 6 through 10. He said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul, leaning on his spear, with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my lord." Whether this account was true, or the Amalekite was lying to gain favor, is debated. But David's response was immediate. Verses 14 through 16 record, David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down, and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David executed the Amalekite for claiming to kill Saul, even though Saul had been David's enemy. The Lord's anointed king was not to be killed, regardless of circumstances. The irony was complete. Saul lost his kingdom for sparing an Amalekite king, and now an Amalekite claimed to have killed Saul. After this, references to Amalekites in the Bible become rare. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 43 mentions one final encounter. "And they destroyed the remaining Amalekites who had escaped, and they have lived there to this day." This happened during King Hezekiah's reign, centuries after Saul. Some Simeonites attacked a remnant of Amalekites who had fled to the hill country of Seir. By the time of the divided monarchy and the later biblical period, the Amalekites had disappeared as a distinct people. The nation that once controlled the southern desert, that had attacked Israel at Rephidim, that had formed alliances and raided settlements, they were gone. The divine decree spoken at Rephidim had been fulfilled. Their name was blotted out. Their identity as a people ceased to exist. If this journey through biblical history has opened your eyes to details you've never noticed before, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our next deep dive into Scripture's most fascinating stories. Share this video with someone who loves biblical history or anyone curious about the lesser-known peoples of the Bible. And let us know in the comments, what aspect of the Amalekite story surprised you most? Until next time, keep exploring God's Word. There's always more to discover.